In this episode, I bring back Dr. Stacey Shelby, author of Love and Soulmaking, Searching the Depths of Romantic Love, and another book, Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype, a guide to becoming a whole, indivisible woman. Besides being an author of two books, Stacey is an educator and depth psychotherapist and adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where we both received our PhDs in depth psychology with a specialization in Jungian and archetypal studies. If you'd like to listen to our first chat, it's season 1, episode 6 from March of 2022. I can't believe it's been a year. It's titled Relationships as Vessels of Transformation. The link is in the description box, along with links to Stacey's books. So today we're going to dive into love. It is February after all. Now, if you're like me, you have a love-hate relationship with holidays like Valentine's Day because you feel like mothers should be appreciated every day, not just on Mother's Day. And you don't need to be shamed that you're not in a relationship on Valentine's Day when all of your friends are. And you know in your heart that it would be so much less stressful if they didn't shove Christmas down your throat before Halloween even happened. On the other hand, one day of reflection as we move from the last day of the year to the first day of a new year can indeed change your life. Sure, it has nothing to do with the literal day, but psychologically, the symbolism of death and rebirth, or of the deeper meaning of whatever holiday, can break through the superficiality of collective experience. So, let's allow the deeper meaning of love and romance to break through the superficiality of Valentine's Day. If you celebrated the holiday and things are going well, you'll have a new lens to apply to your romantic relationship. If you didn't, that same lens will help you reflect about past relationships and wonder about how to see what you never could see before as you get back out there. And you're really going to find juicy stuff if you've been in a long-term relationship or marriage. So let's get started. Welcome back, Stacey.
Deb, it's so good to see you.
Yes,
Thank
a
you.
lot has changed since our last conversation, and we could start by having you give my listeners a little update about what's going on in your life, including your move to the US.
Yeah,
Welcome.
thank you so much. In the move to the US, it does tie in so directly with our talk today about love, although maybe not necessarily romantic love, but love of the soul, right? So
Mhm.
California has had a dear place in my heart my whole adult life. And I really enjoy how I feel when I'm down here. And so I've had this desire that's never really gone away to be down here from Canada, from British Columbia. And the opportunity unfolded about a year ago, just coming up on a year ago, to be able to be here and in the spirit of following what soul loves. My son and I, we're here. We're in California. I kind of have to pinch myself. It has not been easy. It's a labor of love, and following soul is often about following passion, and that asks a lot of us. It's demanding. So I'm really living the tasks, and I'm in it, and I'm grateful and love being here in California. And yeah, it's just wonderful.
And I say I love it a lot. I just know, I just noticed that. But we are talking about love. But anyway, you're right about relationship with place.
Yeah.
And sometimes some of us are just called to leave. And it can cause a lot of anxiety because your head wants to say, well, that doesn't make any sense. But
Yeah.
we have to follow soul.
Yeah.
So I love it. I like it. I'm so glad you're back. I said this time I want to dig deeper into your book, Love and Soul Making. And I think this quote by Dr. Dylan Hoffman from your foreword will call our listeners like a siren. It calls to me. Quote, romance is first and foremost about the individual's calling to love soul, their own soul, and the soul of the world, and reciprocally to find soul in, to make soul from, and to serve soul through love's many expressions. It's beautiful. It's like poetry, actually, because
Mhm.
even as I read it, you can't really grasp it with the mind. It almost doesn't make sense with the mind. Rather, you feel enveloped by this truth that exists. So I really like how you share brief readings from your book on Instagram. I enjoy them very much. Listeners, you already can tell Stacey has like just a really nice, calming, very romantic voice, actually. So I thought we could do something new in my interview with Stacey, and we could incorporate having her actually read excerpts from her book. So I thought we could begin with you reading the opening paragraph in chapter 1 of Love and Soul, which is titled Invocation. And then we can linger and just see where you want to take us from there.
Perfect. I love it. It sounds like a really nice structure. Thanks, Deb.
Mhm.
So I'll start with holding up the book and all my pink tabs. That's for today. And yes, that quote from Dylan, Dylan is a colleague and professor at Pacifica as well, and has become a personal friend over the years. And I was fortunate that he was the substantive editor on the book, and so knows the book and material really well. And he wrote just a beautiful foreword of really understanding life and service to soul and the Anima Mundi. And the book, in fact, is dedicated to the Anima Mundi. So that's the journey of love and soul, which often personifies as romantic love.
Wonderful.
So I've got a hard copy. I think you've got a soft copy, but I think the pages are similar. So the first paragraph, chapter 1, Love and Soul Making Invocation. Romantic love is the ultimate transformer. It enthralls with a sip of love potion or enchants with the prick of Eros's arrow. Who can resist? But as romance unfolds, we are enticed into greater awareness of self and other, sometimes through a crisis that ensues. The only way through is one tentative step in front of the other. The old idealized life dies away and new life gestates quietly. With each step, we are invited to look into our deepest recesses, to discover what we didn't even know existed. Each revelation is a mirror and a glimpse of our own soul. We come to marvel at the person we are getting to know, the one who is looking back at us with a new gaze and who is giving us new view of ourself. Something within us doesn't follow societal rules, but has its own, which are only revealed to us a bit at a time. This other within us challenges us and brings out the best and the worst in us, our fullness. She is Psyche, the human soul. She pursues what she loves, which is beyond all logos and rational safety. Psyche follows Eros, who is the immortal god of love. He is love as the sacred connecting principle. We encounter these two most poignantly in the arena of romantic love. As we walk with them, we get to know paradox, including the paradox of knowing sacred, divine love through the experience of embodied human love. In embracing soul as life's muse, we come into relationship with, indeed, we fall in love with, mystery. In following what we love, we follow soul and experience enchantment in our own unique and precious life.
Thank you for that. Oh, there's so much there. But I ended up circling two words that were intriguing to me. One was we come to marvel at the person we are getting to know, and something within us doesn't follow rules, which for me, I've been conscious of that, but and has its own, which are only revealed to us a bit at a time. So in my experience, as I surrendered to soul, I really feel still that not everything is being revealed to me, because perhaps I'd say, forget it. I'm running the other way.
Nobody would do it if they knew what they were in for.
Exactly.
So
So
laugh, scaring all the people away.
but it is so worth it, right? So I'm just going to share my quote on your book, which I'm so excited about. But this is the reward. Soulful ecstasy awaits those who surrender to the hidden agenda of romantic love. But it's a different kind of ecstasy. It's an ecstasy that doesn't really depend on anything except your relationship with soul. So, what would you like my listeners to know about chapter 1, what you're trying to get across, or whatever pops out to you, or whatever?
Yeah. I think romantic love is a external mirror of, and not at all to minimize the value of having companionship,
Mhm.
but it's that, and also an external mirror of an internal process of coming into love with one's soul, and to be in love with one's life, to create one's life, or co-create rather, with that which is greater, whatever that is for each person. But in following Psyche, we really do live a life, I want to say, like, on fire. Like, it's a very vibrant, vital life. It asks a lot, don't get me wrong, but it's also, we can look back when we're 80 and go, oh yeah, I lived a good life. I took risks. I experienced what I could. I followed my heart. I followed joy. I followed, the path that was leading me somewhere, even though we don't really know where, right? And of course, it's not about the end of the journey. It's about the journey itself. And so following soul, as personified through the experience of romantic love, really creates that pathway for us. But not even romantic, like all forms of love. Love
Mhm.
of place is what I'm really in right now. And it feels very Aphroditic here. I live close to the ocean and the waves, and everything's sunny and warm, except not today. A storm from BC followed me down here. So,
Well, and what comes up for me is I refer to it as living fully. So, because what does good mean, right? So, living fully means when you follow soul, you might get swept up in something, but then there's going to be like a counter something else, right? As maybe plunges you into a kind of depth that causes some temporary suffering or anxiety or uncertainty or whatever it is. But when we see those as gifts, as part of the process, as building the capacity to linger in those feelings, or those emotions, they transmute into something new, into a new insight, into a new idea, into a new creativity. So, one of the things I often say when my clients share, oh my gosh, this just happened, with my partner or whatever, I'm like, that's such a gift. Oh my gosh, it's an invitation. And so then over time, they get used to thinking about, oh, it's not the end of the world. I don't need to be scared that this is going to end. It's like, oh, that's it. That's the work.
yeah.
So I
And then
love it.
finding the gifts in those challenges, exactly. The
Hmm.
gold, finding the gold.
So that's a nice introduction. As we move to chapter 2, which is titled Relationship as the Vessel for Transformation, we talk about how you talk about how myth is relevant and how it can assist us in finding meaning in our own romantic experiences. And if you don't mind, I'd love for you to read the first paragraph of this section, which begins on page 33. It's another long one. And I just think it captures that perfectly, how relationship really is this vessel for transformation that we're often not even aware of what's trying to be transformed. It like exists at this unconscious level, the
Mhm.
unconscious between the two people, just like having a field day playing on a playground. And we're like,
Yeah. Yeah, no
so-
doubt. Absolutely. Yeah. And the reason we talk about myth so much in depth psychology, which a lot of your listeners will know by now, but myth has a way of describing symbolically archetypal patterns, and Psyche really understands symbolic language and metaphor. So when we talk about myth, we can look at relatively stable patterns that play out symbolically within people's lives and within their psyches. So that's part of, so myth is just part of depth psychology.
Mhm.
And so I explore that a little bit here. So, and that is this section, how is myth relevant? That's the one you have, is that
Mhm.
right? Yeah,
Yes.
because
Yep.
we do different versions. Myth expresses an internal process that is universal. Imagination is everything. Whatever we imagine, we can strive towards manifesting. But where does imagination stem from? It is not the conscious personality that imagines, the conscious personality receives the image. Psyche, as the world's soul, is the imaginer and wellspring of inspiration. The anima mundi speaks to our personal psyche, and then hopefully our personal consciousness in her symbolic and metaphorical language. Myth, like a magnified dream, is one of the ways that imagination is manifest symbolically. It shows us the various patterns being enacted as though in a theater, both collectively and personally. Myth shows us the archetypes at the core of the complexes that are warring, questing, or uniting. We may experience this as internal struggle with conflicting perspectives over a decision to make, a somatic struggle as the body wrestles with differing values between the head and the heart, for example, and literal struggle in our personal relationships, work, and lives. In order to understand the deities and myths acting out as patterns in our lives, we must use double vision to see symbolically and metaphorically. The expression of getting hit with the proverbial 2x4 speaks to not paying attention to the internal warring elements so that it becomes literal. Yes, myths may be lived out literally, but if we see through to the mythic narrative, we can understand and relate to the divinities, the archetypes. We can think of myth as a magnified dream that belongs to the collective, and we are the collective. After all, the collective is the collection of individuals within us. Thus, myth also affects us.
And we so are not prepared or instructed on how to use myth and symbols and metaphor to find meaning in what is happening to us. And we get on a hamster wheel trying to think our way out of things. I really like one of the things I marked was because I even had this realization that you don't imagine, you receive images. So this is really powerful that the conscious personality receives the image. It doesn't create. We don't force imagination, but we kind of think we do, right? When we talk about fantasies, we think we're consciously creating a fantasy, but if we really are having a fantasy or experiencing a fantasy, we're receiving it from our unconscious. And wow, which can also be terrifying depending on what the fantasy is, right? So you talk about these warring things. So there's that. I love the metaphor of theater, that what are all these characters that are in us? Yeah. And how can we, instead of feeling such anxiety about the character that maybe is showing up as an emotion of anxiety, what is it asking? What is it really? What is the character? The mythic character for me that has played the biggest role in my journey is Hermes.
Yes.
Oh my, Hermes is all about transformation, is on the edges between conscious and unconscious. And plus he plays so many roles. And for my listeners, he's the Greek god that is known to be a guide of souls. So through this individuation, and also a communicator and a messenger. And so he might show up in an email that's unexpected, and then also a trickster. So I have had to be tricked into so many things, because you might say you want to follow soul, but if you have a lot of complexes that work against that, there's my war inside. Like I want to follow soul. I am a rebel, but I have this working against me. So yeah, so wherever you want to go with that, that's just sort of what came up for me right away.
I'll maybe back up to the consciousness receiving the imagination. And so initially, as imagination and daydream and fantasy and night dreams occur, we are in that receptive state. And if consciousness can be semi-aware that that's happening, we can retain some of that. We can notice it. Sometimes we'll be daydreaming along and we'll have no idea where we just were. Somebody will say, "Oh, where were you?" And we'll be like, "Oh, I don't know." And then consciousness hasn't caught hold of it. Or similarly with a dream, they float away. But when we have something, and that happens, quite a lot, consciousness is nowhere near as big and vast as the unconscious. But as consciousness develops a stronger relationship to the unconscious, so these two seemingly disparate, irreconcilable opposites come into relationship. And as they do, then consciousness can co-create and work with the imagination and the unconscious. And so that's where we can really, really effectively use active imagination, which is what Jung called it. The alchemists just called it alchemy. There's some question about the degree of consciousness they had in terms of what they were doing internally and externally. But my experience, and therefore my belief, because of my knowing through experience, is that when we work at that imaginal level, in that co-creative capacity, consciousness with the unconscious, with the imagination and the contents of the unconscious, that's where real change can happen. Like just the magic can really, really happen at that level. And so when we work with imagination in order to bring those ideas into the world, then we are in this co-creative, active role. But we are not the creator. We are maybe more like a vessel, right? And it's so important to remember that.
Yeah, I like to talk about it as well, there has to be an openness, a kind of surrendering where you are allowing creative intelligence to flow into you, do its thing and flow out. And in order to create something that only you can create in partnership with it.
Yeah.
So I've had many of those moments where I've written something, I've got swept up in something, and time stands still or goes fast, right? And all of a sudden you're like, did I write that? And you didn't write it alone.
Yeah.
You just, and that's when you really recognize that you're partnering with something bigger, is when you know and you don't hog the credit for it.
Yeah.
Right. You're like, and that takes being vulnerable
Yes.
and right. And giving over some, loosening the grips, loosening.
Control. It's
Yes,
the ego
exactly.
has to let go of control and just show up to let whatever, writing is, because I know that one well. It's a process of showing up, sitting down and letting it come out, and then getting all the editor. That's where the critic can actually be helpful, is when the
Mhm.
editing process is like, how can we make this better? So
Yeah. It also this is just coming up a memory. It also reminds me of during the beginning of my research, when I felt, there's so many resources and books, and right, you can't possibly read all of them. But in the beginning, every book that my intuition took me to, I had to read the whole thing. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I can't keep doing this, but I feel like I need to for these books. And so I just trusted that at some point that would stop. That
yeah.
then the next book I picked up, I'd be like, oh, I only need that paragraph out of there. That's all. And then I remember checking in with you, and this is Hermes, because I don't know what made me check in with you, or you checked in with me. And I was sort of like swept up in just the feminine, I guess, just like absorbing is what I was doing. And then I don't know what you said. You didn't need to say anything. It just prompted me. I was like, oh, okay, time to bring in my consciousness, time to bring in the masculine to turn a corner and begin to think about, I've absorbed long enough, but now what is it that's coming? What is the insight that I'm gaining because of absorbing all of this? So
Yeah.
again, this sort of like this partnership, which building that capacity to allow your consciousness to allow you to surrender to unconscious is
Yeah.
tricky. It takes some time.
Oh, it takes time. Yeah, it takes a lot of time. And then when you've exactly those processes, so the ego, as it's developed in the first half of life, then comes into relationship with the unconscious, and we can call that the feminine, the soul, psyche, all the archetypes. They're not quite interchangeable, but for this conversation, that's fine. And then that one receives and gestates and does all of the percolating. And then now we have to bring in a new kind of masculine energy, right? A new kind of masculine principle or active principle. If we're kind of done with words of masculine, feminine principles, we just can call it an active one,
Mm-hmm.
but it has to then bring into the world the work that has been gestating. Otherwise, it's like it just gets stuck in the underworld, right? It never makes it back. You know, in the myth of Psyche and Eros, it never makes it back from Hades with the beauty ointment, with the gift, with the boon. It just lingers in the underworld. It requires the masculine or active principle to come and carry it out into the world. There's a co-creation between the two opposites of, you know, the king and queen in alchemy, or masculine, feminine principles we talk about a lot. Although I'm having more and more trouble with that language because of it just so easily conflates with men, women, right?
Yes.
That's a whole other ball of wax, but they're different energy principles that have to work together in new ways, because the old way, when we're not yet conscious of the unconscious, will not serve the new life, right? It'll try to pull us back with its sticky tendrils, but we have to stay on our course and stay true to that, following that heart path, the soul.
One of the ways that I've enjoyed sort of talking about those, you know, the feminine and the masculine is, and I don't remember if it was Edward Edinger where I got this, but was styles of consciousness. I find that really resonates with people, the styles of consciousness. So, because there's no judgment, it's not, styles of consciousness has no baggage, right?
So what would it mean? Because I'm happy.
So,
I
so
like new
this,
terms.
so like styles of consciousness. So the masculine being, you know, linear and forward and rational, and it likes to make things need to make sense. And the feminine consciousness being, I love meandering, mysterious, patient, strategic, that sort of thing. And so, because if you just take those words, right, and not attach them to feminine and masculine, but instead describe them as like ways of being, like ways. So if I go out and decide I'm going to be in the realm of the feminine today, I'm going to have a completely different experience out in the world than if I go out and I'm like, I'm going to have this other style of consciousness that's more goal oriented and achievement oriented. But in the end, they have to work together to produce the new whatever it is. It is not one or the other that produces the creation.
Yeah. So. And it's not, I mean, it's absolutely not. And if we are using words of feminine and masculine, they have to be, in my mind, paired with principles, so we understand that they're energy sources, or yin and yang is another good one.
Right. Yes. I love it. So, okay. Something that can be helpful is placing now we're getting to romance, modern romantic love within the bigger context of how it's actually a rather new part of our evolution. And archetypal energies seem to want to push for new expressions over time. And this can be challenging as we've learned to project a lot along the way, right? We get used to a certain kind of thing that can become stagnant and even oppressive. And so in this, I think one of the things that's happening right now is the breaking down of this, the kind of romantic love where we projected so much onto this idea of the magical other. And I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that may be part, like, it's such a spiritual projection, right? Like you talk about, well, you're going to talk about that later, but it's such a really heavy projection. It's almost has the energy of like a religious projection. So I wonder if, as people detach from conventional notions of religion, where we projected everything onto that we've sort of taken some of that and projected onto then this ultimate partner that is supposed to be our partner for life. So I thought our listeners might appreciate your reading a paragraph about this from chapter 3, which is titled Romantic Tragedy. So let's see. For me, since our pages are different. For me, it's on page 73, and it begins, what has occurred in the evolution from courtly love to modern romantic love?
Yeah. Yeah. And I might just preface that before that's a perfect paragraph for that. That notion of devotion, from what used to be spiritual devotion in about the 14th century, when we started with courtly love, or is it the 11th century? Gosh, I'm terrible with years. I believe it's the 11th century. where courtly love starts to develop, that devotion then shifted where the man would be like a knight or something along those lines, and he would be devoted to the female of the land. It was generally not consummated as sexual love, so that part wasn't typically part of it. And there would be this devotion of servitude to the feminine principle embodied in this usually royal person, woman, princess, queen. And so that devotion then evolved over the years into what we currently have as romantic love. So it's ultimately this patriarchal notion that has evolved out of a spirituality that then became, a devotion to this other person. And the devotion element is maybe misplaced or displaced or lacking placement these days, because we're reimagining religion in so many cultures and traditions. And so the experience of loving very often replaces that connection with the divine other, even the ecstatic union that can come from sexual encounter, right? And so recognizing that this evolution has had its roots in spirituality, in patriarchy as an institution. And then now we're here where we've got couples trying to cohabitate in really expensive cities and raise children and empty dishwashers and buy groceries and cook pasta. And it's like, it's just too much. It was never meant to be that way originally. So it's become this unmanageable thing where it's supposed to fulfill the spiritual and the mundane. Of course, that isn't working great for a lot of people, and some people are finding ways to do it, but lots of people are being very creative about that now. So I'll pick up from that page.
Okay.
For me, it's 72 in the hardcover.
Yep.
What has occurred in the evolution from courtly love to modern romantic love is that we've muddled the distinction between human love and divine romance, the latter of which was initially imbued with a sense of sacred worship. In the West, we make romance the basis of our marriages and love relationships, and the cultural ideal of true love. In romance, there is an association with passion, fire, and excitement, whereas human love involves the lived experience of relating to another individual. Through this muddling of love and romance, women have become identified with the idealized archetypal feminine. Arguably, it is also true that men have become identified with the idealized archetypal masculine for women, perhaps in the role of the chivalrous knight errant in shining armor. The problem with this, of course, is that we become blind to the whole person, including differences, so-called flaws, and uniquenesses, when we project an archetype onto someone. Initially, particularly when we are younger and less experienced in life, we are unconsciously drawn to a partner we think will bring us wholeness, completion, or totality. I've referred to this as the white picket fence dream. However, once we have all the pickets painted and in place, we realize, something is wrong. This isn't wholeness at all. This begins the painful disillusionment period, usually in midlife. Due to such disillusionment, we might deepen into our own spiritual aspirations in search of effective ways of achieving a sense of wholeness and completion, or even just fulfillment.
Thank you for sharing that. I think there's so much dismantling going on right now. So much to talk about. But one of the things that's being dismantled is this notion of relationship. It was 4 years ago when I was just a baby depth psychologist and I was doing a workshop and I had a millennial age woman say, "What is relationship?" And I said, "You're brilliant." I said, "You are part of the generation that's going to help us figure that out, actually, because the rest of us are so trapped in these old notions that have grown stagnant. How do we know they're stagnant? Well, there's just so much suffering because we try to force ourselves to adhere to them. So I'm so interested in the dismantling and the exploration of relationship. And the other thing that I think about that makes me think of Esther Harding, actually, her book is that because she did talk about way back in, the early, whenever that book was published, like 1930s or something, she was already talking about the changing, the coming liberation of women, basically, and the changing relations between men and women and that sort of thing. And one of the things that she talked about was sexuality. And sexuality is spirituality, really. And so she warned that as we do become detached from old ideas that are kind of rigid and constraining, that if it becomes just like this free for all, that we might end up degrading parts of these experiences, whether it's sexuality or romance or spirituality. And then people might get swept up in other sort of rigid ideas. So I think that one of the things that I am concerned about is that as women have become unleashed, that the unleashing is a literal unleashing as opposed to like a more metaphor, symbolic, a playing with metaphor about, is it really about quantity of sex and tools and that sort of thing, and I can do whatever I want, or is it like, what is the deeper meaning of your sexual desire, and does it always have to be acted out literally? So I don't, you go wherever you want, but that's what one of the things that I'm really intrigued about is that as the notion of relationship is sort of being played with, and what does it mean? How do we work in, like, what's the deeper meaning of what is the point of all the dismantling, right? Where is it that we're actually trying to get to? And I would say it's like our own, instead of using other people to make us feel whole, how are we going to become whole in a way that doesn't burden other people with being the victims of our projection, making them responsible for our wholeness? So I don't know. I feel like I went all over the place, but
Yeah, I think there's more than one comment.
yeah, I know. So you
One
just
to grab
go,
hold
you
of
go
it.
wherever you want.
Um, that deeper exploration of relationship and what is relationship, like what a brilliant question. And I think everybody needs to ask that, as they're adults now. What is it to each person at this stage in life, and then exploring what is it authentically versus what is it in terms of what society expects. Um, and I think emotional safety and security is a really interesting thing to talk about because everybody deserves to have emotional safety and security in relationship. And yet it's incredibly vulnerable to be in relationship. So how to create that safety for self and partner, in order to do that, but not keep it so safe that it becomes rigid and fixed, So there's another tension to manage about being able to trust oneself enough that, that if things do need to shift and change, that they can make those shifts and change, that they're not clinging to this other person for a sense of safety or wholeness or completion or healing the wound from childhood. Like nobody gets out of childhood without some sort of wound, usually abandonment or engulfment. And so looking to that other person to heal that, in a paradoxical way, that can happen, but the other person is not the one who's healing it. It's the grist for the mill, that if the one who's feeling the wound can do the inner work, usually with support of a therapist, then they can go into that wound and figure out how to heal it. And often that means, how do we create safety? Sometimes that's boundaries, sometimes that's asking for what we need. It's incredible how hard that is, especially for women. Yeah, and so that would be the what is relationship and how do we create safety without clinging to this rigidity and like, this is my lifeboat, because it's not. And so that would be one thing I would talk about that. Esther Harding certainly was imagining the dissolution of the current paradigm of romantic love and marriage and wholeness. I believe she had what I would call I think she called it maybe even a romantic friendship, where she cohabitated with a female friend that was apparently a non-sexual relationship. It was just women cohabitating. And I think as we have our Gen X women coming up in age, there's a lot of single Gen X women. So I think that paradigm will probably catch on a bit more as well. So there's all kinds of different um, models of relationship that we're starting to see emerge as people are connecting with what feels true to them and what their needs are at different stages and phases in life.
And I think if for the people who are really exploring themselves and their needs, you end up being a better partner, right?
Yes.
Once you do that. So once you sort of take, I am really excited about the younger generations because now I was like a rebel. I was trying to do my own thing back in the 80s and 90s. And I absorbed the backlash. Which drove my midlife crisis, was like reconciling old sexuality and spirituality wounds. And there's so much more freedom, or there's so much more demand to like figure it out on your own now than there was. Like you really had to be brave back then. And now people are just like, yeah, I'm just going to try this thing. So I like that. I love that. And it's going to be messy. It's going to be messy, and there's going to be people who will get hurt, but that is going to be the working out of this, whatever is going to emerge next. So that whole,
Well, and I think we need to sell the getting hurt a little bit because nobody's going to sign up for it.
right.
Like the value of following soul and following love and being open to getting hurt by doing the reflection and taking risks and going through disillusionments about romantic love is that you get to feel this like I want to use words like empowered in living your truth, and you're the authority of your life, and there's a lot of integrity and trust, and it is a relationship with spirit that is at a very personal level as well, in trust in the universe or cosmos, whatever language. So there's this knowing of this unshakable core that we get, that just makes it so worth the journey, right?
And if you can detach from this expectation that anything ought to have a certain outcome, you can really see how each encounter is preparing you for another kind of level of experience.
Yeah.
And
And that's true in long-term partnerships or in people that have multiple partners or shorter term relationships or whatever configuration it is. Absolutely. Each experience expands that capacity.
Yes. Great. I like it. Next is chapter 4, titled The Magical Other. This chapter gets to the juicy stuff, which we've kind of begun to touch on, the idea of projection. And once a couple can begin to see how their partners are mirroring back that what wants to be explored in themselves, new insights can bring a feeling of liberation as you begin to love yourself more and release your partner from being perfect. And I have found that in my own, experience, that once you take back projections and you begin to like develop these things in yourself, you actually come into like having more compassion for yourself, which leads to the capacity to have compassion for another person. So again, it's like your work makes you, a better potential partner. So I thought my listeners would enjoy hearing you read the full paragraph on my page. I think it's about projection. So on my book, it's page 115. Oh, it's this. It starts with, we can come to recognize the soul through loving another.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, and I'll just say about projection, we never stop projecting.
Right.
It's the natural innate thing that we do as humans. We see ourselves in the world, and we do that in the arena of romantic love or any relationship. We also do it in nature. The world is always mirroring back to us. And I think one of the things I try to enjoy, one of the things I work on enjoying, is projection versus perception. So projection is the question and exploration and curiosity of, oh, where is this in me? So I see my partner as being a little bit lazy or not very driven. Okay, where is that in me? Am I overdriven? Am I underdriven? Is it in shadow? What's happening there? What's my relationship to that quality? Versus perception is I'm actually pretty good with my, like, it's sort of a neutral experience of drivenness, but my partner, yeah, he's gaming 8 hours a day or whatever it
Mm,
is, and he's actually just not very driven. And then it's the question of, am I okay with that? Right? That
mm,
can be just fine. It doesn't
mhm.
have to be a deal breaker. It's this, is that aligned with my values? Are the other things more important? So discerning between projection and perception, and then measuring them up against your personal values, right?
It's that it reminds me of Psyche's task, the sorting through.
The
That's
sorting.
that's how I talk about with my clients when there's a thing that goes on. It's like, like what part is yours? What part is theirs? What part is there's some mutual thing going on, and sorting through that.
Yeah. So anytime there's discordance and somebody's not behaving how we think they should be, or we're not behaving how they think we should
Hmm.
be, which happens all the time in
Hmm.
romantic love, then we know there's some projection going
Hmm.
on. And then get curious. Curiosity is the
Yeah.
way to navigate that, right? It
Yes.
keeps us out of the power struggle and out of the judgment. And then it's like, okay, who are you?
Hmm.
Who am I? What's happening here? And let's be like just sincerely curious about it.
Yes. I love
Mhm.
it. I love curious.
Curious is always good. Okay, so here we are. So we are on 115. We can come to recognize the soul through loving another. The external journey is the catalyst for the inner journey, and one mirrors the other. We are all animal with instinctual knowing, communicated through our bodies. As such, love is meant to be lived and experienced, both in the reality of our inner worlds and in embodied human loving and relatedness, regardless of the duration of that love. We must tend both relationships, allowing the transformation to occur on both the personal and transpersonal levels allows for a deepening engagement with soul. Human relationships can bring us into this conscious engagement, but it can be the vessel through which we learn that we are so much more than a singular ego with all of our childlike wantings, yearnings, and expectations. Running headlong into love with another who has their own soul journey in life is enough to thwart any ego's agenda. Love inspires us to be our most complete and authentic selves. Love asks for our best. As we recognize the reality and independent personality and life of the soul, we can foster human love that nourishes the soul and complements our soul journey. That takes ego strength and courage because the journey of love and soul is the journey of individuation, and that path includes suffering. It is the path for those called to be the best version of themselves.
Yes. I love the independent personality and life of the soul, right?
Yes.
So, you know, our soul's journey is not usually fully revealed to our consciousness.
No.
And same with the other. And when you read this, I just recall one of my first post-divorce romantic sweeping up with younger man that was truly the vessel for transformation. And luckily I was studying depth psychology because I was so swept up. I was like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. I know like what I'm liking and I know what I'm not liking, but I know there's something deeper going on here. And it was quite a surprise. And when Hermes made it really clear, like, oh, this is over now. I was sad, like you still go through heartbreak, but it made sense. It was
Mhm.
clear. I had this clarity that that was all to prepare me for unleashing creatively. Actually, that whole relationship was about reconciling these opposing forces of sexuality and spirituality. So it can be well, and then you mentioned suffering again. So yes, there's suffering, but oh, I wouldn't like redo anything. And even though I'm not in relationship with that person, like how would that ever work anyway? The place in my heart that relationship and that person has for me is really at a very deep level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these people that are what I would call romantic partners through the individuation proper process, like the really intense period at midlife, they do hold dear places in our hearts because they've been such an important catalyst in our becoming, right? And it's a very
Yes.
special experience to be engaged
Yeah.
in.
And if you don't have the kind of awareness or capacity to wonder and be curious about what was the hidden agenda there, you might get stuck in suffering, right? And then not really be able to appreciate the beauty of the experience that was not meant to be permanent.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
since well, I'm gonna skip over now to skip chapter 5 here.
Okay.
But listeners, of course, can check it out on their own. I wanted to get to chapter 6, which is titled Beyond the Romantic Tragedy. You take on the larger forces that influence what we hope is our unique experience of romantic love. These influences have caused wounds in us all. I'd love for you to take on the topic of patriarchy. And of course, this could be like a whole week of podcast interviews, right? Patriarchy and the concept of polyamory in its deeper form of many loves. I talked with Dr. Julie Hamilton about sort of polyamory and getting my listeners used to that. You know, the root is many loves. It's not always attached to the notion of sexuality, that it's really broadly about these different kinds of loves we have, including friendship, including, you know, et cetera. So there's a couple of things I thought you could just read a little bit to give people a taste. One is on page one. Well, for me, it's 168.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, beginning of the last, and it begins, now I want to explore some lived, is that what I want you to do?
I think I've got it marked, unless you changed it.
Well, let's do this. Oh, I was going to have you read more. Let's do this. On the next page, you kind of get right to the point, where you say patriarchal culture is distinct from males, men are not the problem. Let's read that.
Okay.
Yeah, that paragraph.
All right. So that's 169 for me.
Yep.
Patriarchal culture is distinct from males. And this is in italics because it's so important. Men are not the problem. The problem is patriarchy. Again, we have this language problem of conflating men with patriarchy, and we have to disentangle that because then we're perpetuating the problem. It just it doesn't work. So it serves no one to contribute to divisiveness by blaming or shaming the other. If there is a direct and specific behavior from someone that is causing personal harm, then assert yourself and protect yourself with your voice first. If the behavior persists, you will have to decide if you want to have that person in your life. This fosters self-trust. An important point to remember in connection with the fact that men are not the problem, but rather an overly one-sided patriarchal culture, is that we have an inner patriarch within us. We all inevitably do. Just by virtue of living in a patriarchal culture that's been around for more than 2,000 years, Western culture is built on the foundations laid during the Roman era, when it went from being a ramshackle republic to conquering the vast lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. Thus, it became the thriving Roman Empire for approximately 400 years. Colonization is steeped deeply into the psyche of patriarchal culture, and reconciliation is required. We need to repair culture collectively, and we also need to do that individually. Since the Roman Empire is the foundation for white and non-Indigenous imperialism, the inner patriarch is deeply entrenched. The more we become conscious of the patriarchal water that we are swimming in, the more we can change how we inhabit in and change how we relate to others in our lives. It's not an easy task to identify all the ways patriarchal culture influences us because we are so immersed in it. One route many people are following is reconnecting with their ancestral lineages and cultural traditions.
Thank you. And the other thing that was in the other paragraph that we kind of skipped is that men have been as wounded by patriarchy as women. It is a different kind of wound. And I think once you can explore your own sort of relationship and wound within patriarchy, you can have more compassion for the different kind of wound that men carry.
Yeah.
And I had another one of my colleagues, Dr. Sean Miller. He talks a lot about male sexuality, and one thing that's coming up for me that was just really interesting that he found in his research was that, let's say you have a group of men, and um, and one of the men is being, saying misogynistic things, that all the men that the majority of the men don't really approve. They don't like it, but they don't say anything because they overestimate the sexism of the men that they're around. So think about that. Like literally so many men are, no, I'm not okay with that. But at the same time, the way that they're suffer is that they are not men then, if they're not men, right? But yet they have no idea that the majority of the men are with them. And if only they could be vulnerable enough to admit that, then that, think about the powerful tipping point, right? And we see like so many, what I call quality men who are really with us. I mean, they're really more than the other men who aren't. But anyway, you take some time to sort of, that's why I really wanted you to read that, because it's not a man problem. It's a problem of living within this, yeah.
And the inner patriarch and the inner misogynist or the inner sexism that both men and women have appropriated over the years. So really taking the time to do that inner work to catch that in our own lives. Just as an analogy, as a figure, that'll show up in dreams, because everybody has to reconcile with the old father and the old mother in their psyches. For me, it personally used to show up as this really militant general. And I had to like come to terms with working with this general figure that was just so like, yeah, toxic. Like it was just the epitome of what we would call toxic masculinity, right? There was nothing supportive or life-giving about it. So when these figures show up in our inner world, then we know it's time to start coming into a different relationship with those figures, and then really deconstructing that.
I love that. And then could you just read this paragraph where you talk about bell hooks? And so it's page 171. It starts, hooks also suggests a circle of love.
Yeah.
So it's just a little taste to get people thinking
different
about
ideas.
Yeah.
So this whole chapter does have quite a few suggestions, but the circle of love is one that I personally kind of like. So hooks also suggests a circle of love with committed bonds that extend beyond the privileged partnership. The circle involves nurturing multiple committed bonds rather than only one. This likely includes deep romantic friendships, even if there is a primary partner. Ideally, both partners understand the importance of sustaining committed bonds in love and romantic friendships. These are friendships with men and women with commitments which are consensual with the primary partner. They are non-sexual, even though there's an erotic tension. The sexual longing is not repressed. There is instead a choice to use eros as a basis for strengthening a committed friendship, similar to diverting libido, the way Jung described, but for the purpose of fostering connections. Romantic friendships and a circle of love are a threat to patriarchy and to heterosexism because they fundamentally challenge the assumption that being sexual with someone is essential to all meaningful, lasting, intimate bonds. Sex, then, is no longer the delimiter of a relationship.
Yes. I mean, I think this is going to be new for a lot of my listeners to hear, but there's so much there. And yes, friendships between men and women are threatening to patriarchy. And I'm so happy to see that within like Gen Z and millennials, it's not a big deal. They're like friends with everybody. Like they hang out in groups or alone or whatever it is. But I remember the moment that I had this experience. And I've always had a lot of male friends because I don't know, they were interested in talking about what I wanted to talk about. But I remember an experience, and this was during my whole midlife thing. And I was having a beer with wine and a beer with a guy, a friend. And we were talking about something that was really interesting to me. It probably had to do with social justice, something like that. And all of a sudden in our conversation, I noticed that I was so aroused. And in my head, I was having like this little tennis match of like, am I attracted to this? Like, I
Right.
didn't look like that. I was pretending so he could not tell of what was going on, my internal dialogue. I'm like, am I attracted to him? I
What's
I
happening
don't
right now?
I don't think so. Like, when I imagine kissing him, I'm kind of like, no, but I'm like, I was so confused by what I felt. And I realized that I have felt that a lot in my life. It had nothing to do with sex. It had to do with, sexuality is creative energy. Right?
Yes.
It was about what we were talking about. And it was about like he had this way of being that when we got together and had a conversation, holy mackerel, something was being created, but it wasn't a baby, right? It wasn't about sex. So I think, I think this is still very difficult for couples,
Yes.
right? Where there are, I think there are probably movies about this where there is a couple and then there is one of them has a strong relationship with the opposing identity or of sex or whatever. And that is very threatening to the
Yeah.
romantic partner.
Yeah.
So, but this is what's happening as things start to dismantle, which this also can be terrifying for people.
Yeah. Again, with the safety, we like to know our partner's not going to leave us, right?
Yeah.
And so if it feels like a threat to that, then jealousy comes up. We are not going to avoid jealousy. We have to handle it responsibly and not become possessive and cling to the other person. So allowing for those experience of eros to be there through that connection where there can be arousal through Eros's presence in the conversation, the creativity of that, right?
And speaking of jealousy and envy, Dr. Jolie Hamilton, I've had a couple of conversations. She went to Pacifica too. I don't know if you've ever met, but her whole thing is she's a researcher of jealousy. She also, her coaching practice helps couples color outside the lines. So she actually provides a framework, a depth psychology framework to help couples. So instead of just like diving into polyamory or going to a whatever, it's a very conscious process for the couple to begin to explore their needs and how they meet each other's needs and other relationships and how that fits in. And so automatically you have to talk about jealousy then, where heterosexual couples just don't even deal with it. They just get mad.
They just get mad and threatened and possessive, and then the
Right.
possessive becomes destructive. Mhm.
Exactly. This is great. So, oh, I'm so glad we got to touch on that. So, finally, we come to chapter 7, Love of Soul. There are two pieces I want to talk about. The first being that the language of soul is the imagination and metaphor, which we kind of touched on in the beginning. And let's see, on page 185, so the second paragraph, which starts, we spend so much of our lives.
Yeah,
um, I love that paragraph. So if you don't mind reading that, it's beautiful.
perfect. We spend so much of our lives yearning for something, but we can't quite fathom what it is. So many of our apparent goals and the things we think we want turn out to be masks for our underlying desires. They are symbols for our true values and qualities. Our deepest wants are not reducible to physical or material goods, or even to a physical person. They are psychological characteristics such as love, truth, honesty, loyalty, and purpose. We crave something beautiful, valuable, and deserving of our devotion. When we attempt to reduce everything into a desire for a tangible object, such as a home, a vehicle, a better job, or a human being, it never works. We are, without recognizing, seeking the sacred. The sacred, on the other hand, cannot be reduced to anything else, and it too is seeking us. As a result, we may understand our longing for romantic love as symbolic desire for connection with the sacred. Paradoxically, genuine, loving acceptance created in mature partner companionship can be sacred practice.
Mm, yes. Well, depth psychology is sacred practice.
That psychology is sacred practice.
Applying it to everything
Yeah.
is a sacred pursuit. Uh, okay. And then, well, is there, wait, let me go back. See. I don't know. I just kind of feel like that stands on its own. Is there anything that you want to touch
Uh,
on when it comes to that?
paragraph that you, yeah, I mean, that might be the last paragraph that you've flagged.
Nope. There is one more, which I
Yes.
think is, well, it's the one about, I love this. It's the one about how you discern between spiritual pursuits and soulful pursuits. That one's on
Yes.
page 191. I really like that as sort of like a concluding thought
Yeah.
for
I
people
think
to
it'll
think
pick
about.
up nicely from what we're just talking about with the um seeking the divine in the object of our desire, right? So
Mhm.
recognizing that we're seeking the divine in the object of our desire. And then the paradox of truly being in a meaningful companion relationship. Human love can also be sacred practice.
Mhm.
And so that leads nicely to this final paragraph that we'll read today. Spiritual pursuits tend to turn into idealistic perfectionism, whereas soulful pursuits are embedded in the nitty-gritty, messy entanglements of life where we are experiencing all of our embodied human affects. We find soul always in the thick of things, in the repressed, in the shadow, in the messes of life, in illness, and in the pain and confusion of love. Spirituality often seeks to transcend these lowly, uncomfortable conditions of the soul. It's easy to find ourselves spiritually bypassing and trying to avoid all of these discomforts of being in the human condition, even though we may be unconscious of that desire to bypass. This movement, maybe we call it the New Age movement or the self-help movement, can be harmful to soul because it is pursuing something that is idealistic or is an unrealistic ideal of perfection.
Yes, those two things do definitely go together because as soon as we try to reach for something ideal, we've kind of lost it. Like we've gotten out of the place of soul, which is this place between spirit and between earth or body, mind, all of that. And soul is where that's where the juicy stuff is.
Mhm. The human stuff.
Yeah.
I like to differentiate spirit from soul because we often don't think about
Mhm.
those terms. And I would say, and I happen to identify as a spiritual person, but I would in no way say depth psychology is a requirement for that. Atheist and agnostic are equally good. But I would say spirit is part of the eternal, and it's the part that would continue on. It's connected to the cosmos, to that which is greater. And when it's in the body, it's encased in matter. It's in
Mhm.
the physicality of matter. And so the spirit in matter is the part that creates soul. So when that body dies, I would say the soul dies with it, but the spirit
Mm.
would continue. But the nitty-gritty experience, the soulfulness of spirit being in matter is the juiciness of the human experience, right?
Yes.
Then it's very unique to each person, even though we're all interconnected through the anima mundi, the world soul. The individual experience of soul is very unique to each person and each life.
Yeah, and I think like soul, I have a little paragraph in my book about what I think soul is, and it cannot be pinned down. And I say that soul is a noun, soul's a verb, soul's an adjective, soul's an adverb, soul is a way of living, soul is a right? Like, and that would make sense that you can't pin it down.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I think this is a great place to inspire my listeners to search their depths and those of the romantic experiences, whether past, present or in anticipation of their next encounter. Um, Before we sort of conclude, do you have any parting thoughts for my listeners?
Um, no, that just feels really complete and lovely. And it was nice to move through the book chronologically and to explore the deeper meaning of soul and relationship and touch on a little bit from each chapter and the progression for that. So, yeah.
Yes, it was great. Thank you for indulging me and reading and sharing your voice. And just, there's no way people aren't going to want to. There's just so much. You just got a little taste, you guys. So, Stacey, this was such a soulful conversation. And I hope my listeners will go back and listen to our last chat and purchase your book or both your books. It's the kind of book that each time you read will allow you to go deeper and deeper into the depths, which often leads to rewards of new heights of ecstasy. Where can people find out more about what you're up to? Where can they follow you? You're always sharing experts of your book on Instagram. Maybe you're doing that other places too. Maybe you've got other podcast interviews they can link to. Like, how can they find out more, follow you, and also support you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Deb. I appreciate that. So both books, Love and Soul Making and Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype, which was my first one, are available on Amazon. That's the easiest way to get them. My personal website has all the podcasts and interviews and blogs, and there's quite a lot of free content on there. That is drstaceyshelby.com, and that's drstaceyshelby.com. And likewise, my social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, I kind of use Twitter. They're all at Dr. Stacey Shelby. And again, that's STACEYSHELBY. Yeah, and I love to hear from people and love to have feedback. I get messages every now and again from email or on Instagram about people have read the book or something, and just really appreciate those, or people wanting to work together as they're in their own exploration, actively working as a therapist. And so that's main work. Yeah, I'd love
That's
to hear.
great. And I'll put all those links in the description box to make it really easy for people. So thank you, Stacey, for coming back and helping us surrender to our soul's calling towards love of soul. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Stacey about love and soul making. In the description box, you will find links to Stacey's book, website, and other resources. Until next time.